Welcome to History San Diego. I'm George Farrar. In 1860, a decade after San Diego had formed up the city and county governments, there were 731 people counted living in the city and 4,324 people counted living in the county. In fact, there were actually fewer people living in the city than had lived there in 1850, and more people living in the county than had lived there in 1850. And by 1860, the area was burgeoning with crops and livestock. Just not that many people by comparison with other places in California. And 1860 was a presidential election year. Many San Diegans cast their votes for Vice President John Breckinridge for president in the 1860 presidential election. The Democratic Party had split up into different factions and candidates, and ultimately, Abraham Lincoln of Illinois was elected president. Let's see how San Diego and California voted. Here we can see how vast San Diego County was back then, larger than it is today. And then we take a look at the U.S. presidential election results by county, as much as could be gathered from that time for the year 1860, and we see how things break down politically in the country. We see that San Diego has gone for John Breckinridge, much like a lot of the South went for John Breckinridge. We see that Northern California and areas in, you would say, I guess, the middle of the country at that time, went to Stephen Douglas of Illinois, U.S. Senator Stephen Douglas. And then we can look towards the north and more towards the east. And we can also look at San Bernardino County, and we can also look in the Bay, San Francisco Bay Area, and we can say they went for Lincoln. So that's the way presidential politics shook out in 1860. And it's amazing how there was election, and then the following year there was a war. It was interesting how the presidential election politics that year was so split. Abraham Lincoln would carry 18 states. He would get 180 votes in the Electoral College, and he would get just under 40% of the popular vote. It's an interesting breakdown that we see here geographically, and it also sets the stage for what will happen during the Civil War. And so we all know what happened after the election. The Confederate States of America split off from the United States of America, with California remaining in the Union, and President Abraham Lincoln takes office on March 4th, 1861. The Confederates attack Fort Sumter in April 1861 in Charleston, South Carolina, and the Civil War begins. By August, the governor of California has called up for a regiment of volunteers to fight for the Union. And so all of this is happening, and we can only imagine what the people of San Diego were thinking as all of this was happening. To the Californios, the Spanish-speaking Californios and the Native Americans who had been around, who remembered Spanish governance, and then the takeover by the Mexican government, that would be these older people in the community. And then for them to see California to become the 31st state to enter the United States of America, and then a decade later for there to be war. It wasn't inconceivable to them to see a governing power to fall away quickly. It just wasn't. Men went off to war from San Diego, and the military had barracks, as we talked about earlier in the series. And amidst all of this, however, the biggest challenges and struggles that San Diego and California were going to face were going to be immediate. It was going to be at home in California, and it was going to be the weather and the land. Because these struggles and challenges that were related to weather and the land throughout the early 1860s, they were going to have dire consequences on the people. As all of this is going on, the initial battles of the Civil War are fought. As we enter the winter of 1861, going into 1862, the Southern California region, along with other areas of the state, including Sacramento, the area was hit with big rain and windstorms. And San Diego experienced massive flooding in 1862. In January of 1862, there was a massive storm that caused water in the bay to flow quickly into the San Diego River, resulting in an overflow. Homes in the lower areas of what we know of as Old Town today were flooded out. Of course, Mission Valley flooded heavily. This was a catastrophe. As 1861 became 1862, storms were impacting the region and the state all at once. This was part of the Great California Flood that drenched the state. Then, the flooding was followed by a bad drought. The drought devastated the local cattle industry. The industry had originally been dominated by the Spanish-speaking Californios. However, as misfortune and debt predominated, more and more the original people to the area were pushed aside. They were pushed aside by newer settlers, established U.S. citizens, mostly from the East and elsewhere. In the early 1850s, we learned in an earlier show, William Heath Davis of San Francisco had attempted to build Newtown, and we talked a lot about that. And as a part of the development, he constructed a wharf, and there would be ships that would pull in, and there was some damage here or there from time to time. It was damaged by a ship in the early years, and while it was used from time to time, he was not able to turn a good profit from it, but it was there and it was being used. Ships were using it as late as 1860 when some repairs were made. Now, I told you in a previous show about the military barracks that was constructed in the new town, what would have been the new town area, that were originally constructed, and they were occupied by U.S. Army infantrymen at this time. And by the early 1860s, there were men deserting. There were incidents of vandalism in a place called Pantoja House, was destroyed by the Company D infantry. They were also taking apart a lot of the buildings, including the wharf. In 1862, the wharf had been destroyed by the U.S. Army because towards the end of 1861, they were taking apart anything that had wood on it to use the wood for heat, to burn for heat. Because of the cold and the dampness. They were exposed out onto this old area of this new town development that had failed. So these times were raw and desperate. Now, the United States government gave William Heath Davis a $6,000 settlement years later after he sued for damages to the wharf. So it was something that was definitely recognized as something substantial that had happened. And it didn't help matters that the wharf was taken apart, right? So when we look at a list of the City Board of Trustee meetings, we can see the early 1860s were a time disruptive to business as usual, as men volunteered to fight or sought adventure and money back east, while people sought to rebuild their homes and lives from the flooding and the drought. They were trying to stay alive and doing everything they could to survive. Ironically, one would think that there would be a lot of local newspaper accounts of all of the damage and tragedy. However, the primary newspaper, the San Diego Herald, published its last newspaper on April 7th, 1860. Now, let's take a look at the misadventures of Cave Couts. Every once in a while, when you read and research history, there's a person that appears often in that history, and you become intrigued. And that's what's happened with Cave Johnson Couts. He came to California in the late 1840s, and he would be a force here in San Diego in the 1850s and the 1860s. And so I want to tell you a little bit about him from a brief biography that is in a book called A History of San Diego by William Smith. And so he graduated West Point Military Academy in 1843, and he served on the frontier until after the Mexican War. He was at Los Angeles, San Luis Rey, and San Diego from 1848 to 1851. In 1849, he conducted the Whipple expedition to the Colorado River. In 1851, he married Isidora Bandini, the daughter of Juan Bandini of San Diego. In October of the same year, he resigned from the Army and was soon after appointed colonel and aide-de-camp on the staff of Governor Bigler. In the Guerra insurrection, he served as adjutant, and at the court-martial was judge advocate. He was a member of the first grand jury of San Diego County in September 1850, and a county judge in 1854. In 1853, he removed to a tract known as the Genhome Grant, a wedding gift to his wife from her brother-in-law, Abel Stearns. Now, the interesting part about him, and I think where he built a lot of his wealth and his power, was he ended up becoming the sub-agent for the San Luis Rey Indians, and he was able to secure all the cheap labor needed for the improvement of his property. Ultimately, though, there's some interesting legend about him. He entertained Helen Hunt Jackson while she was collecting materials for the book Ramona, which is interesting. And part of the story of Ramona is supposed to have been laid at the Gahome Rancho. Now, his wealth was cattle. And we talked about the cattle industry earlier and what was happening with that. All the problems with the cattle industry that were happening, I'm sure he was impacted certainly by. But what ultimately did in his profits were the passage of a no-fence law, and that resulted in him basically failing economically in a sense. And he died at the Horton House in San Diego on June 10th, 1874. They say he was over 6 feet tall, perfectly straight, and weighed 165 pounds. He was a man of good education, strict integrity, and gentlemanly manners. So that's what the official biography says. And so you heard me quote from that. So I'll talk a little bit more off the cuff with you about some interesting things about him. He was a surveyor. He was in with the mayor, the first mayor of San Diego. And if you'll read more and more if you go into a history of San Diego beyond what you're seeing or hearing from the official biography. There's a lot of legend. There's a lot of story. Even had a brother who later on became a county clerk and a recorder, a postmaster, justice of the peace. So these people were politically involved, and I've talked about some of his misadventures back in the more earlier years of the 1850s. Now we get to 1865. In February of 1865, he's alleged to have killed someone. There's no better way to get an understanding of how justice worked in San Diego in the 1860s than to look at what happened related to a murder of a man in the plaza in what we know of today as Old Town on February 6, 1865. Now, Cave Couts had a alleged history of allegedly abusing people. In 1855, he was indicted for beating 2 Native Americans with a knotted rope. He was acquitted on an assault charge. He was indicted for manslaughter on another count when that second victim had died, but charges were later dropped in that case as well. This is from an account from the San Diego History Center. Later on, in May 1870, it's alleged he inflicted dangerous wounds upon a teacher that he had hired to tutor his children at his ranch. there's a lot of bad blood that this guy seemed to have been having with people, and he had a former employee named Juan Mendoza, and there was bad blood between them. Supposedly, Couts was walking through the plaza, was carrying a shawl, felt threatened, dropped the shawl, and revealed the shotgun, and Mendoza was shot and was killed. They took forever, of course, to depose a witness. The incident was in February of 1865. The deposition was taken later on in October of 1866. And so Cave Couts was acquitted by a jury of his peers, found not guilty of the crime, and he moved on with his life. But I hope that this story, the story that I shared with you, gives you an idea of what was going on in San Diego. In fact, I hope that the past two shows have given you an idea of what was going on at such a, one would say, an obscure time in San Diego. The big growth spurt hadn't happened. The people of this community were beset by economic and climatological calamity. They had to deal with the national politics and competing groups involved in the Civil War. Though the battles were far away, there were military impacts, as we discussed. It was definitely an unusual time, and I am going to be very excited later this season to be bringing you a lot more positive developments as the city gets beyond the flood and the drought and the Civil War and begins to grow in earnest. And so where do we go from here? Well, in November, I'll be presenting to you a series within our series where I take a look at a decade of American history, looking at American history from the San Diego context, taking a look at America in the 1860s, including the Civil War, the early attempts at Reconstruction, the amazing technology that was starting to roll through, the railroads, the Transcontinental Railroad. There's going to be a lot that's going to be, again, coming in from the east, moving out towards the west year by year, that's going to be impacting San Diego. And then we're going to begin our Great San Diegan series in December with our Great San Diegan series premiere, the Alonzo Horton story. And then we'll begin to look at Horton's Addition and the boom years and all sorts of other items in 2026. So if you haven't already done so, I do want to encourage you to please subscribe to the channel. And I do want to invite you, if you haven't already done so, to check out our Facebook group page, History San Diego, on Facebook groups. And I want to thank you for watching. Take it easy. See you later.